This is the ultimate guide for getting the golden Eclipse 8 badge in Risk of Rain 2. I'm going to show you how to get this badge so you can assert yourself and increase your value as a human being. While the tips in this video are centered around Eclipse, many of them are universal and should help you in any difficulty, Eclipse or otherwise. This is everything I've ever learned in my entire life compressed into one video. There's a lot to cover, so maybe grab a snack or McDonald's. Treat yourself, child. There will be timestamps in the description for everything covered in this video, but first I want to get everyone on the same page, so let's briefly go over what this heckin' Eclipse thing is all about anyway. Eclipse is basically Risk of Rain 2's New Game Plus mode. It can be found in the alternate game mode section from the main menu. It starts on Monsoon difficulty, and every time you beat the game, a new modifier is added to make the game a little bit more spicy, with a total of 8 modifiers or 8 Eclipse levels. Each survivor tracks each Eclipse level independently, meaning you could be Eclipse 8 on Bandit, but still be Eclipse 1 on Rex. You have to beat the game a total of 104 times to get that coveted golden badge. Don't let that scare you off. I know it sounds daunting and quite frankly like a huge pain in the ass, but it's hardly a grind. The vast majority of people I've talked to have really enjoyed their Eclipse climbs. Once you get into it, I think you'll discover how much depth is added to the game by these modifiers. And if you're like me, you'll have an incredibly hard time putting it down. It really forces you to relearn the game, and I truly believe it's the best way to play Risk of Rain. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, the number one tip I have is to just start playing. In the grand scope of things, a 35-minute video has nothing on the amount of experience you'll gain from the 150+ hour experience. So just start. Even if you're somebody that struggles to beat Monsoon, I would still recommend jumping in feet first. Eclipse 1 is basically Monsoon anyway, so why not get some of the early Eclipse levels out of the way as you learn the game. Gramps, I'm sick and tired of your buffoonery. Get to the point. But before I do, I want to go over mindset. It's something that's often overlooked, but it has a huge impact on your gameplay, both in terms of enjoyability and speed of improvement. Now, I will warn you, you're gonna die. Many times. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. You learn more from failure than you do from success, Dumbledore. Sometimes the game will throw you in bullshit situations, and it can be very tempting to get mad and blame the game. But every time that happens, I would encourage you to instead think about exactly how you died and how it could have been avoided. This will ensure it won't happen again, or at the very least, happen less often. Dying is a core part of the learning process, and the sooner you come to terms with that, the better off you'll be. Moving on to the general approach, it takes 104 wins to get the golden badge, but the order in which you get these wins can make a huge difference. There's 2 ways to go about this. You can do it by character, beating all 8 modifiers in a row on a single survivor before moving on to the next one, or you could do it by Eclipse level, where you try to beat each Eclipse level on all of the survivors before moving on. This is up to personal preference, and I've seen people be successful both ways, but I would highly recommend doing it by Eclipse level. That way, you can get all of the easy runs out of the way first, and by the time you get to Eclipse 8, you'll have over 90 wins under your belt. Where going by character, the difficulty really spikes and you don't have as much time to get the hang of the modifiers. I think you also get more variety playing it by Eclipse level. That way, if there's a survivor you just can't stand for whatever reason, you're not locked into playing them for 8 levels. But both ways are totally valid. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk modifiers. I'll go over each one and talk about some strategies to counter them. Eclipse 1, ally starting health minus 50%. This isn't really that impactful. Like I said, it pretty much just plays like Monsoon. All it does is make you start each stage at half health. It is a nerf to drones, squid polyps, and most notably Engineer, with the turrets also starting at half health, but there's really not much to worry about with this one. It can be annoying stage 1, but once you get any amount of healing, you can counter this one pretty effectively. Eclipse 2, teleporter radius minus 50%. Now, that description is a wee bit deceptive. While it might not sound like much, when you reduce a sphere's radius by 50%, that actually accounts for an 87.5% reduction in total volume. In other words, the teleporter is 1/8 the size it used to be. Not only does this affect the teleporter, but pretty much anything you have to charge. This one can take a while to get used to, but once you do, you won't really have to think about it. The main thing to understand about this one is there's no penalty for leaving the teleporter. If you feel overwhelmed while charging, it's totally okay to leave and come back to it. If you've played a lot of Monsoon, chances are you're used to hiding inside the teleporter 95% of the time. This is a habit you'll have to break, especially in the later stages. Just remember that patience is a virtue. Playing it safe is usually the best option. And one more thing to mention about teleporters is if you find yourself in a situation where you're having a really rough run and the boss just isn't dying, try to focus on just charging the teleporter. Don't even kill normal enemies if you don't have to, because the game will stop spawning enemies once the teleporter reaches 99% charge, regardless of whether you've killed the boss yet or not. This means you can charge the teleporter and then systematically kill all of the enemies on the stage without them respawning. Eclipse 3, fall damage is doubled and lethal. This works very similarly to Artifact of Frailty. For me, this was probably the hardest modifier to get used to. Up until this point, fall damage has kind of been a joke. The game hasn't really given you a reason to avoid it. This is where that changes. You'll be playing around this modifier constantly. Luckily, there's a lot of ways to mitigate fall damage. Most survivors can cancel it by using their mobility skill. I will call out Railgunner specifically for being a little bit weird. For her, don't use the landmines when falling. That will actually accelerate your fall. Instead, shoot your SMG at the ground and the knockback from it will slow your momentum. The more attack speed you have, the better. Void Fiend is also a bit tricky. His trespass ability is vertical and scales with movement speed, so this is a very obnoxious modifier to deal with. But there is a small tech you can do. If you didn't know, trespass is different depending on whether or not you're sprinting. If you ever have to cancel fall damage, make sure you aren't sprinting to get the minimum amount of vertical distance. Captain and Engineer are affected by this modifier the most. They don't have any mobility abilities, so you're going to be relying on items to deal with this modifier. This is one of the hardest modifiers, so don't feel bad if you struggle with this one. Moving on to Eclipse 4, enemies move 40% faster. Rest assured, this only affects movement speed. They still attack at the same rate. For now. This one isn't too bad. In the early stages, you'll hardly notice it, but later on, things can get a bit dicey. Enemies will start to move faster than you do, so this is where you'll want to start investing in movement speed if you haven't been doing so already. Now, if you're having a run where the game just isn't giving you speed items, try to take advantage of the stage itself. Baiting enemies into geysers or taking shortcuts are great ways to get enemies off your back quickly. While we're at it, let's talk a bit about dodging. First of all, stage geometry can play a huge role in taking less hits. You could risk dodging an Elder Lemurian spread shot, but why even take that chance when you can just get behind a rock instead? In most cases, you won't have that luxury, so you'll want to step up your strafe game. The key to dodging most enemies is not walking in a straight line, zigzag, weave, arc, and most importantly, run in a circle. Circles are the universal counter to most enemies in the game, including Mithrix. The primary reason this is so effective is because it bunches enemies together, so you only have to deal with whippersnappers from a single direction. When in doubt, run in a circle. Dumbledore. That's really the best advice I can give you on dodging. It's one of those things that can really only be learned by playing the game. If you're not the best at it right now, that's okay. Getting better at it really is a process. In some ways, it's a lot like learning an instrument.
Brand spanking new. I gotta break it in.
Keep in mind, avoiding damage is what Eclipse is all about, and if you keep playing, you will get the hang of it, I promise you. Simply by playing the game, you are improving, even if it doesn't feel like it sometimes. Eclipse 5, ally healing minus 50%, or in other words, all of your healing is half as effective. Yeah, this one is brutal. It affects literally all of your healing, and the in-game descriptions do not reflect that. For example, Rejuve racks claim to double your healing, but you actually need 2 of them to negate this modifier. Now, just because healing is half as effective doesn't mean you should be investing in it twice as much, because this modifier is preparing you for Eclipse 8 where damage is permanent. Kind of. You're going to need to get used to health being a finite resource. Instead, your defensive items will need to be invested in damage reduction or mobility. Don't get me wrong, you will still need some healing, but start to wean off it. Note, Barrier and Shield are not affected by E5 and are more powerful now that healing is neutered. Eclipse 6, enemy gold drops minus 20%. I feel like this one's pretty self-explanatory. Enemies will give you 20% less money. I will point out, Gore's Tome, Roll of Pennies, and Brittle Crown will still give the full amount. It's just the money you get from killing enemies. Don't overlook combat and blood shrines either. Combat shrines can be a bit questionable in the late game, stages 4 and 5, but early on, they don't pose much of a challenge, and you're throwing away money by not using them. This modifier will slow down the looting phase a bit, but it's basically just Eclipse 5 again. Eclipse 7, enemy cooldowns minus 50%, or in other words, enemies attack twice as often. Like Eclipse 4, this modifier will help you get better at dodging. Again, investing in mobility and running in circles, or arcs, is a pretty effective counter. The other part of this modifier tests target acquisition, which is taking down the biggest threats first. And when I say biggest, I mean the most present danger, not necessarily the largest physically. For example, blind pests attack constantly, so they're a much higher priority than a stone golem that only attacks occasionally. Try to identify where you are most likely to take damage and neutralize that threat first. This is a very important skill to learn, as it can mean the difference between life and death. And finally, Eclipse 8. Damage is permanent, which sounds impossible, right? But don't worry, it's really not as bad as it sounds. The term permanent is in big air quotes here. It's a pretty misleading description. For one, it resets every teleporter, so you start each stage with a clean bill of health. And two, while there is permadamage, only a portion of the damage you take is permanent. It's based off of this equation, which is basically saying if you take a hit of damage that is more than 2.5% of your maximum health, 40% of the damage you take will be permanent. If you took a hit of damage that's less than 2.5% of your max health, you don't take permadamage at all. Every time you take permadamage, you'll stack the Curse debuff, which despite being considered a debuff, cannot be cleansed with a Blast Shower or prevented with a Raincoat. The only way to remove this debuff is to move on to the next stage or get revived with a Dio. The numbers don't really matter that much here. The big takeaway is smaller hits of damage don't affect you nearly as much as the bigger ones. Depending on the run, it takes roughly 20 to 30 hits from lesser wisps to equal the same amount of damage you take from a single brass contraption shot. Big generalization, but I think you get the idea. Permadamage isn't something to overlook, but the game has been preparing you for this since Eclipse 5, so the adjustment here really isn't as big of a deal as you'd initially think. One really cool side effect of Eclipse 8 is it makes delicate watches much harder to break. Normally they break when you dip below 25% of your max health, but since your max health is lowered when you take damage, that threshold is also lowered. The same is true for elixirs, stealth kits, and Genesis loops. Just remember that your health is a finite resource now. This will require you to play more defensively. Don't overdo it though, you still need to strike a balance between defense and offense. Okay, so that's it for the modifiers. I realize I just threw a bunch of information at you, so I want to take a moment to talk about this more conceptually and, I guess, debrief.
Debrief? Wow, that's what you think we need, debrief?
I've come to realize this section was mainly about mechanical skill. Being able to dodge enemies, charging the teleporter efficiently, not falling off the map like a damn fool. Improving at these things really just boils down to playing the game more. And that's the main thing I want you to take away from this section. The rest of the video will focus primarily on decision making, so stick around. And I hate to bring this up, but if you have been enjoying, consider subscribing or dropping a like. This video is a huge undertaking and it will help it reach more people. Thank you.
This road preaches the gospel. People listen.
Women can't keep their eyes off of men!
Duffy, it's 15 till 8. Will you come into the building and scope?
Help!
Okay, let's talk items. There's a lot to cover, so much so that this part of the video could easily be 4 hours long if I took the time to go through all of it. And that's because one of the things Eclipse does really well is it unlocks a lot of hidden depth to the item system. In Monsoon, it's a lot more one-dimensional. In that game mode, your baseline power is higher and the enemies is lower, so the items you pick up don't matter nearly as much as they do in, say, Eclipse 8, where the game is a lot more unforgiving. This inherently makes items much more valuable in Eclipse and much more nuanced as well. I would encourage you to stop thinking about items as either good or bad in a general sense. Every item has some situation it's useful in, and the value of any given item can vary drastically from run to run or survivor to survivor. This part of the video will be split up into 4 sections: offensive items, defensive items, equipments, and then lunar items at the very end. Let's start with offensive items. What's the best way to deal damage? Well, it's very situational, and because there are so many damage items, it's a very difficult thing to discuss. So what I'm going to do is, instead of looking at items individually, I'm going to go over 8 common build types. This is by no means all-encompassing, but it should help you get an idea of what to look for and when. Number 1, raw damage. This one's very basic, but very effective as well. Crowbars, crit, focus crystals, watches, and armor-piercing rounds. Sometimes all you need to get through a run is the right combination of these 5 items. Damage is multiplicative, and if you find the right printers, you can have a very successful run. Cool thing about this build is it can be used in conjunction with most of the other builds I'm going to talk about. These items will lay a really good foundation and leave you open to any type of build. If you want to know more about multiplicative damage, I have an entire video on it, which will be in the description. Number 2, Bleed. Many of you probably know by now, Bleed is OP. We're talking tri-tip daggers, shatter spleens, and attack speed for stacking infinite damage. This one is very survivor specific. Commando, Nailgun Multi, Huntress, Engineer, and Captain shine most here, but with a crowdfunder, this build can work on anybody. One of my favorite Bleed combos is Polyloot with Shatter Spleen. If you have a decent amount of crit, Polyloot can create hundreds of Bleed stacks in a matter of seconds. This only works with Spleen because it can bypass Polyloot's low proc coefficient, where normal tri-tips cannot. Needle Tick can be useful sometimes, but generally I wouldn't recommend picking it up in the early game, just because a strong Bleed build can really outclass it. With that said, if you're not stacking that much Bleed, Needle Tick is more damage, so I usually wait till stage 4 or 5 before I pick it up, or when I'm pretty confident that Bleed isn't the direction I'm going. On a side note, tri-tips and Spleen don't stack anymore, so if you have a decent amount of crit with the Spleen, Needle Tick is just an extra debuff with no downsides. Number 3, Band. Kaijaro and Runald bands are very strong as well, despite being the antithesis of Bleed. Where Bleed is characterized by a rapid barrage of low damage attacks, bands are characterized with slower, higher damage attacks. Loader, Bandit, Artificer, Captain, Mercenary, and Railgunner are able to utilize bands the most. But unlike Bleed, bands are pretty useful on the entire roster. When it comes to single target damage, bands are king, especially when stacked. and because of that, they are some of the highest priorities in any run. Finding a band printer is essentially a free win. This is also why it's important to start practicing pot rolling. I know it's a bit annoying, but once you get used to the janky pot physics, you can do it pretty easily. I personally think it's almost always worth it to go for pots if possible. Sometimes that does mean losing the run if you take too long, but I value the long-term benefit of learning how to roll pots over the short-term consequence of losing the run. But that's a pretty extreme stance, so I understand if you're not like that. It ultimately just depends on how much you care. But being able to roll pots consistently will make your life a lot easier. Each run has randomized loot, and there's no guarantee it will be good. Bans are the sole exception to this, where you can guarantee them in at least a third of your runs if you develop the skill. Bans are also one of the strongest options against Mithrix as well, just don't get void bans. They're doo-doo. Number 4, Area of Effect, or AoE for short. Very rare builds, but also some of the strongest. Best printer in the game is probably Will-O-the-Wisp. Each stack of this item increases both damage and range, which might not sound like a big deal, but trust me, it is. Will-O-Wisp also has a 1.0 proc coefficient, so combine it with a ukulele that deals 80% of that damage to nearby enemies, and you'll be dishing out more damage than a drunk grandpa on a Friday night. Crowbars also synergize really well with Will-O-Wisp builds, and even better on its younger brother, Voidsent Flame, with the explosion occurring at full health instead of on death. The main downside of having Voidsent over Will-O-Wisp is it can't be used with Forgive Me Please, but I'd still say Voidsent is better in 90% of scenarios. Another great area of effect build is gas plus ignition tank. It can be hard to get a full gas ignition build going because it requires 2 printers instead of 1, but if you do happen to stumble across a situation like this, start going into it immediately, because this build melts like nothing you've ever seen. If you only find a gas printer, it can still be worth it to go into it, but past stage 3, you'll need at least 1 ignition tank for it to remain super viable. The big downside to area of effect builds is they don't do well against Mithrix. Unless you have a soulbound catalyst with the Forgive Me Please, you're not going to see a lot of use from these guys in the boss fight. And for this reason, it's usually best to supplement this with another form of damage. Also, I just want to point out, even if you're not going for a true omega powerful area of effect build like this, you're still going to want to pick up some area of effect items. They are necessary for getting you through the run, and if you don't have any, you'll feel really underpowered in the late game. Number 5, Proc Chain. Multiplicative damage from items like Charge, Molten Perforators, Polylutes, ATGs, Meat Hooks, Clovers, and so on. Now, these runs can be very strong, but also very rare in non-loop runs. For a decent proc chain build, you usually need at least 3 of these items, and sometimes more to see a huge payoff. Most of these items are pretty rare, so this is something that isn't possible in the majority of runs. Generally, I would consider this a good build for loop runs. With that said, oftentimes you can do smaller proc chains like ATG into Ukulele, or Charge Perforator into Polylute, and those are great synergies, but those omega powerful screen wipe proc chains that you're used to seeing require quite a bit of luck. Number 6, Drone. Best combination in the entire game, hands down, is drone parts plus empathy cores. In another previous video, I was able to clear Eclipse 8 with just these 2 items without attacking a single enemy. If you find spare drone parts early on, look for a tricorn, dream for Siren's Call, and you've basically won. And while this is a great combo, oftentimes all you need is drone parts. Buy up every drone you can find, and you're guaranteed to have a decent run at the very least. Downside here is drones don't get your items, so this is the only build that doesn't benefit from raw damage items like watches and armor-piercing rounds. However, they can benefit from your debuffs. Shattering Justice, Scorpion, and Deathmark will all allow drones to deal more damage. And while we're on the subject, drones are very underrated. Even without drone parts or empathy cores, they're actually a pretty good source of healing. And more importantly, drones are a great way to relieve pressure when you're getting overwhelmed. Having a couple gunner drones flying around distracting the enemies can be a huge deal. Same goes for beetle guards. Don't discount these items because they help you out more than you might think. Usually not a great idea to sacrifice items in favor of drones, but if you have the extra cash, buy up as many as you can find. I'll stop droning on and move on to the next build. 7. ICBM. This of course requires an ICBM. This seems pretty straightforward, but there's actually a lot of different ways you can use this item. For one, it's basically a free win on Engineer, assuming you have the harpoons. It can also be very useful for proc chains, with it becoming 3 times more likely to start a proc chain from an ATG. Firework builds also become viable. Having a remote caffeinator with fireworks is a very powerful option, even better if you add in a plasma shrimp. Without an ICBM, 1 firework is 1 shrimp proc, but with an ICBM, 1 firework is 9 shrimp procs. because it splits into 3 twice. Shrimp is also a very interesting item because it's not confined to a proc coefficient. As long as you have a shield and an enemy is hit, Shrimp procs. This creates a very strong synergy with polylutes. These 2 items can reach some ridiculous damage multipliers, especially if you have an ICBM. Number 8, Head Stompers. This is by far the best item in the game right now, especially for Eclipse. Aside from making you completely immune to fall damage, it gives you a higher jump, making for easier dodging. It also has some of the highest DPS in the game. If you have a quail and some speed, you can trimp into the air and nuke the entire map with 1 attack. Bands, ATGs, meat hooks, and either of the ukuleles synergize very well with this item. Stompers also work well with every form of raw damage boosting item. Basically, Stompers are broken. You're not going to see them in 90% of your games, but when you do, getting them is usually the right call, as not only is it the best offensive item in the game, but defensive as well. Alright, those are all the builds I'm going to talk about, but it's by no means every build in the game. It's really only just scratching the surface. Experiment for yourself and see what works. It's really rewarded in this game mode.
I tried this one chili that set my mouth on fire and I had to drink a 2-liter of Mountain Dew.
As Dumbledore once said, the best offense is a good defense. So let's take a look at some defensive items. Now, I don't want to go super in-depth with explaining these items. I'll be working off the assumption you already have a rough idea on how they work. Instead, I'll mainly be focusing on what you should be prioritizing so you can get the most value out of your builds. I will be providing you with item amounts, but remember that each run is unique, and these are only guidelines. Don't feel compelled to follow everything I say to the letter. Sometimes you gotta improvise. So when it comes to defense, there's 3 categories: healing, damage mitigation, and mobility. As we've already gone over, healing ain't it. During the first 4 Eclipse levels, it's pretty reliable, but once you get to Eclipse 5, it's only half as effective, and by the time you get to Eclipse 8, the majority of healing is essentially scrap. With that said, base regen is horrendous, so you will need a little bit. There are really only 2 sources of healing that I think you can rely on, those being Cautious Slugs and Wungus. These items will work in pretty much any situation. Stuff like Monster Teeth and Medkits are super inconsistent. They may help you a bit during the mid-game, but since the goal is to beat Mithrix, you'd be better off scrapping them. Bungus can be good, but obviously you leave yourself vulnerable while using it, so it's not ideal. If you have literally no other healing options, Bungus will get you by, but I generally don't feel comfortable unless I have 2 slugs or 1 Wungus. Pretty much everything in the green tier is trash. Lepton Daisies, Leeching Seeds, and Scythes, these guys are just super impractical. I know a lot of people will probably make an argument for Leeching Seed, but with Eclipse 5 you need a ton of stacks to see a reasonable gain, and at that point you're better off investing those greens elsewhere. On high fire rate characters like Commando, Scythe can be pretty good if you already have a decent amount of crit, but otherwise I'd scrap it. And then red healing items are even more impractical. We already mentioned Rejuve only being a 50% increase, and Interstellar Desplant is actually one of the best healing sources. It's like a souped up Monster Tooth, but again, you can't really use it on Mythy Boy, so it's pretty useless. Now you do have some other options. I've already mentioned healing drones, which again, are super underrated. I think you'll be surprised with how much value healing drones provide. Of course, the big drawback is they die, but that often doesn't happen until stage 5 because enemies have a really hard time hitting them. They generally stay alive for a pretty long time. Slugs and Wungus will always be better, but healing drones can keep you alive until you get to that point. Topaz brooches are also really nice. Having 4 or 5 of them can practically double your health bar. Again, you don't see a lot of value during the Mithrix fight, but they provide pretty good value during the mid-game. Now you also have health increasing items. In this category you have Bison Steak, Infusion, and PSG. Of the 3, PSG is the best. Shield regenerates much faster than health, and one-shot protection isn't really a thing in Eclipse 8. On top of that, it's an 8% health boost that scales as you level up, as opposed to Steak and Infusion, which are just flat increases. Personally, I'm not a fan of these items. Having a bigger health bar means you can take more damage, but it becomes pretty redundant when you realize you have items that reduce the amount of damage you take, or items that let you avoid damage altogether. So it's not that these items are bad, but just outclassed in most situations. And speaking of taking less damage, let's move on to damage mitigation. Getting hit is inevitable, but we have a lot of tools to reduce the amount of damage taken, and by proxy, permadamage. Starting with Repulsion Armor, this is a flat reduction on every instance of damage, so it's your best tool for dealing with small hits from Wisps, Lemurians, Titan Lasers, Clay Templars, and it's also the best tool for dealing with burns and bleeds. These 2 status effects go from run ending to tickle damage when you have this item. Again, it's a flat reduction, so it doesn't scale well, but 1 or 2 stacks should be enough to get you through a non-looped run. There's also Tougher Times. It's a 13% chance to block all damage, and it stacks hyperbolically. While this is a chance-based item, over the course of your entire run, it will even out to about 13% less damage overall. However, its unpredictable nature makes it difficult to rely on. Its void alternative, Safer Spaces, is much better in my opinion. Having a guaranteed block is incredibly useful, as it complements the Eclipse playstyle beautifully. Where the goal is to take as few hits as possible, having an item that blocks all damage every 15 seconds or less means you can make a lot more mistakes. It has a lot of utility outside of combat as well. Normally you have to wait until after the teleporter to use Blood Shrines and Void Cradles because they deal permadamage, but with Safer Spaces, you can use them whenever, even in the Void. It's also one of the best solutions to fall damage. This item stacks pretty well. 25 stacks is about a 1 second cooldown, take that as you will. Safer Spaces is easily a top 5 item. Oddly Shaped Opal is another great option for many of the same reasons. 100 armor is a 50% damage reduction on most survivors. If you're dodging a lot and avoiding damage, this item will have a huge impact. Note, this item doesn't stack very well. Even though 2 opals is 200 armor, it's only a 66% damage reduction because armor itself has diminishing returns, so you don't really need more than a few stacks. And finally, Rose Buckler, 30 armor while sprinting. This is about a 23% damage reduction. On Mercenary and Huntress, this item is really good, but on everyone else, it's meh. Opal is a rarity lower, and it outclasses it pretty heavily. The only reason I wouldn't scrap it is if I didn't have Repulsion Armor, Safer Spaces, or Opals. You're going to want to have a moderate amount of damage mitigation, more than healing, but most of your defensive items should be invested in mobility. Avoiding damage in the first place is always going to be the best option. Energy drinks and goat hooves are your top priorities in any run. As a general rule, if you see either of these items in a multi-shop, you take them. Mocha is also pretty high priority, but obviously it's not as good as the other two. Try to aim for around 7 or 8 of these items. People often like to debate which is better between energy drinks and goat hooves, and I don't have an answer for you. I think it really just comes down to personal preference. Having a mix of the two is probably the best option. If you only stack drinks, it's like going from 0 to 100, but only stacking hooves is less of a speed boost. So if you can, try to go half and half. Hopu Feathers are also at the top of the list of must-have items. Enemies in this game have a really hard time with vertical mobility, so this item will significantly reduce the amount of damage you take. It's another great way to deal with fall damage and is the single best item for avoiding Mithrix. In the green category, feathers are your #1 priority, especially if you don't already have one. Quails are also good, although they do have their drawbacks. They can momentum lock you into unfavorable positions. You give up control of the character for about a second, and that can be scary, so unless you're desperate for speed, I wouldn't recommend more than 1 or 2 of them. Red Whips can also be good if you don't have any other speed, but this is very much a last resort kind of item, except on Engineer, where using the missiles and turrets don't put you in combat for some reason, I don't know. Last and definitely least, there's Hunter's Harpoon. This is an item you don't want. The speed boost does more harm than good here. It has a tendency to rocket you off cliffs and sometimes kill you. Scrap this item as soon as possible. And of course, there's Head Stompers. I talked about this item in the offense section, so I won't get into it too much, but the reason I bring it up again is because it's a great defense item. You get immunity from fall damage and vertical mobility. Great item, but yeah, that does it for the defense items. Let's move on to equipment.
Styling. Hey, everybody gotta wear clothes, and if you don't, you get arrested.
Equipment is kind of a weird category to talk about because they serve many different functions. A lot of times they're used to complement different build types. Crowdfunder is good on bleed builds, Capacitor is good on band builds, Disposable Missile Launcher is good on ICBM builds, and I think you get the idea. You also have equipments that act as utilities, stuff that doesn't directly deal damage but help you in other ways. In this category, the best equipment to have are the ones that help you with looting. Always look out for Recyclers, Executive Cards, and Tricorns. A Recycler is the best thing you can find in your run. It's essentially a 57-leaf clover for your loot. See an item you don't like? Reroll it. There's also a lot of cool cheese you can do with it. For example, there are only 2 red void items, so a recycler will literally let you pick the item you want. Voids in general are super good with the cycler, just because there's so few of them. If you find a yellow or red printer, you can reroll these items infinitely until you get a clover or shatter spleen, but the point is an early recycler all but guarantees a powerful run. While recycler is the best equipment, Executive Card takes a close second. Buying everything from a multi-shop is super powerful. Even if you're buying trash, printers are a thing, and you can get a lot of value out of them that way. Prioritize cards and recyclers over everything else. Trophy Hunter Tricorn is also very useful, but it really depends on the stage and where you are in the run, because some boss items are much better than others. If you happen to have a recycler and you find one, just snipe the boss and reroll the yellow. Easy. Now, while these 3 equipments are top tier during the looting phase, they are pointless during the final boss fight, so either replace them with the aforementioned build-specific equipment, or for pillar skips, equipment that let you skip pillars and go straight to Mithrix, but more on that later. For For now, let's talk about lunars. Lunar items are ridiculous in Eclipse, most notably Shaped Glass, Transcendence, Spinal Tonic, Gesture of the Drowned, and Purity. Shaped Glass synergizes with the Eclipse playstyle pretty heavily, especially when you start stacking it. It does lower the threshold for you to take permadamage, but Shaped Glass is basically like having permadamage anyway, so you don't really notice. Transcendence. Remember how I said shield is unaffected by the Eclipse modifiers? Well, you can probably imagine an item that turns all of your health into shield and gives you 50% more of it would be pretty good. And since fall damage is capped at 2 times your maximum health, not shield, this item also makes you immune from fall damage. It completely negates the effects of Eclipse 1, 3, 5, and drastically lessens the effect of Eclipse 8. In addition to this, you can scrap all of your healing and invest them elsewhere. One of the best items, hands down. Here's a list of all the effects you get from Spinal Tonic. Increase damage by 100%, increase attack speed by 70%, increase armor by 20%, increase maximum health by 50%, increase passive regeneration by 300%, increase movement speed by 30%. If you get Spinal Tonic with Gesture of the Drowned, you really don't need any other items with this combo. These two alone will give you pretty much everything you need. And Purity, reduce cooldowns by 2 seconds, but reduce your luck by 1. This item is very strong, but very situational. You wouldn't want this on a proc chain or bleed build, but for bans and low proc survivors, Purity is awesome. If you have the freezing secondary on Artificer, you can cheese the entirety of the Mithrix fight, or become invincible on Merc. These are the main 5 I'm going to cover, but the vast majority of Lunars are great. The Heresy items outclass your normal abilities most of the time. Heretic is probably the strongest survivor in the game. Hellfire, Effigy, and Brittle Crown are all really strong. There's only a few that I think are particularly bad, those being Egocentrism, Corpse Bloom, Focus Convergence, and both of the Pauldrons. Beyond those 5, Lunars range from decent to game-breaking. So yeah, Lunars are powerful, and if getting the badge is all you care about, these are the items to use. But by this point in the video, hopefully I've made a good case for there being more to this game mode than meets the eye. There's a lot of hidden depth here, and if you're not careful, Lunar items can dismantle the entire experience. When you have items that eliminate half the modifiers or stack infinite damage, there's no real need for strategy or to get creative with build types. Funnily enough, when I posted a teaser for this video on my community page, the one comment I got was this, and I think it perfectly encompasses my point here. To me, Eclipse difficulty is about refining your playstyle and adapting to what the game throws at you. It's about embracing these obstacles, not avoiding them. That sense of accomplishment and perseverance is what the game mode is all about, and Lunar items rob you of that, at least to some degree. And you might counter this with, hey, what about Head Stompers? Doesn't that item also negate Eclipse 3? Why is that okay, but Lunars aren't? And I think that's a fair point, but my problem with these items don't lie with their overall power. There's nothing wrong with having powerful items, as long as they're balanced. Head Stompers are red, and because of that, you don't see them in 90% of runs. Lunars, on the other hand, are incredibly common, and you have the ability to get up to 5 of them after every stage in the Bazaar, and if you don't like them, you can reroll them. And that's my main problem, not with Lunars themselves, but with the shop. There's nothing wrong with having these items every once in a while, and overall, I think Lunar pods are fairly balanced. But when you're getting these items in 90% of runs, they become crutches, and will limit not only your rate of improvement, but I think your enjoyment as well. Lunars are part of the game, and if you want to use them, who am I to tell you otherwise? But to experience everything this game mode has to offer, I would strongly recommend not using the Lunar shop in the Bazaar at the very least. I hope you can forgive me for this rather opinionated segment. Normally, I don't like putting my opinions in guides like this, but this entire video is built from this perspective on the game, so I couldn't really get around it.
Yo, what's up? I'll tell you what's up. My foot in your ass, that's what's up. You keep calling here with this foolishness here.
Okay, so now you know which items to look out for, but how do you apply this information? What is the general strategy you should be following? Well, to answer that question, I'm going to turn it over to a very good friend of mine and fellow YouTuber, Race.
You find yourself at a fork on the strategy high road. On one side you read 5 minutes per stage, and on the other you read full looting. So which path do you take? For the record, I believe there is a right answer, especially for the modifiers that Eclipse introduces, and it's the full looting road. Both of these strategies are popular for a reason, but this road is more successful and consistent, so we're going to break down both to see why. The 5-minute rule is the idea that you move through the game faster than the enemy scales while picking up some loot along the way. Easy enough. Although the original name is kind of a misnomer, since most of the time you'll likely be going through the stages at a slightly different pace than the strict 5, the name was popularized as more of a guideline, so we'll call it rushing. The full looting method is the idea that your items you collect will push you ahead of the enemy scaling always. Some people confuse this with intentionally going slow, but the strategy is to go as fast as you can while you collect all the items. There's no reason to not also try to keep the enemy scaling as low as possible while you power yourself up. So to start off, let's bring in the visual representations. To make it as simple as possible, let's start with 2 bars. The top bar represents the enemy HP. This is the only stat we care about as the game scales. This is the main determining factor of what makes difficulty. While enemy damage does scale as well, this is a reminder that avoiding damage to begin with is in the heart of Eclipse, so let's dismiss that for now. The bottom bar represents our available combat power, which we can only really move forward with items. So for the sake of abstract discussion, let's say that when the bottom bar is further along, the player is doing well, enemies are easy to kill and clear waves of, things are looking good. When the top bar is further ahead, the enemies are tough to kill, and so they start to overwhelm the player. Seeing this, it might be easy to picture that the Russian approach would do well. Since the top bar moves at a steady pace, it would seem easy to just stay ahead of it and power through the stages while the game is at its easiest, right? Right? Well, this is where the biggest misconception comes into play with this strategy. The game does not scale linearly with time like most people think it does. Every teleporter you go through increases the current scale difficulty by 15% and starts increasing the speed of the scaling by 15%. What this means is that as you go fast, so does the game. Let's start with a basic example. We look at 2 runs that are both at 30 minutes in. One is using the Russian rules and the other is using full looting. For sake of example, let's even pretend that both runs had the same exact items even. Notably, you can see that the Russian strategy run actually has higher level enemies at this point by a lot. Well, that's weird, right? Doesn't that seem a little backwards? Isn't that why we wanted to go fast to begin with, to keep the enemy HP low? Let's expand on this example a little bit more and let's pull it apart. Both runs spent 30 minutes at this point, they just spent their time doing different things. The Russian run spent more of its time clicking on teleporters and the full looting run did not. Even with the same items, the Russian run accelerated the enemy scaling more and they are now further behind by comparison. Teleporter spawn enemies also only give about half as much golden XP, so more time proportionally spent in these events just makes buying items that much slower. Since the concept of Russian strats is predicated upon keeping the enemy as weak as possible, it seems backwards that the game is almost always harder comparatively in these scenarios per time spent, because of the disparity between lower player power and the sped up enemy scaling by rushing through teleporters. Well, so why don't I just spend 30 minutes on a stage, or 40? Wouldn't that be more conducive to keeping the enemies lower level? Why am I supposed to go through full looting efficiently and quickly if all I'm doing is speeding up the game like the Russians do? Well, because with items you scale even faster than the game does with time. But finding yourself in a position where the enemy is scaling, but you aren't, is bad. I think a lot of the confusion with the concept of rushing is caused by pushing the perceived significance of just keeping the enemies low. A common trap is to look at, let's say stage 5 for instance, in both runs, and say, hey, the full looting run is scaled more by this stage, but they often neglect to point out how powerful the player is by comparison. It's about keeping the enemies as low as possible, but prioritizing and maximizing your potential for player scaling to the extreme. So let's see how we do that. To very simply understand the effect of items' power, let's take a side road into looping for a second. Knowing what you know about enemy scaling, how does looping even make sense? From a Russian perspective, how would it be reasonable that you can go through the stages at that rate, scaling the enemies so much so quickly? Wouldn't the enemies just be too powerful? How is it that looping runs usually end with players able to walk away from their keyboard while they massacre the entire stage? The multiplicative effect of items cannot be overstated. Items get insane. Every new item you bring in your item pool has the potential to multiply the power of your entire item build by many times over. As you continue to go through and collect more and more and more, these compounding effects simply break the game. And obviously, the larger pool of items you have, the crazier the exponential scaling. Even on looping rushing runs, there's a point you will eventually get to where items just overtake whatever scaling you allowed the enemies to have. Again, player power scales exponentially and incredibly quickly. The game also caps enemy levels at 99, so there is in fact a limit on enemy HP values. Meanwhile, your player power goes up to in-overflow breaking points far beyond comprehension comparatively. You could theoretically win every run just by making sure you're far past the enemy capping point, but obviously that would make the Eclipse climb take a ridiculous amount of time, adding hundreds of extra hours. There's a reason though Simulacrum feels so easy. Even when the enemy cap goes up to level 10,000, enemy power simply can't stand in the way of an abundance of items. Several last content creators have even used mods to uncap the enemy level fully, and have had runs where we fought level 100,000 enemies at only a few loops into the run. The enemies were still being cut through like butter and the runs were still fully AFKable. So now that we have a good foundation of item power and how the player scales, Wouldn't it make more sense that we want to try to find as many items as we can over the course of the run? We want more chances to get necessary items like speed, but also take advantage of that quick and powerful exponential scaling. We want to push our power to its limit by the end of the run. Talking about item amounts is tricky because of the inherent amount of RNG in the game, but in full looted Stage 6 Mithrix runs, the player is expected to receive somewhere in the ballpark of 80 or so items, half of those coming from solely Stages 4 and 5, the player's main scaling ground. That's a pretty massive pull at the end of the day though, since even a few items can make a build many times more powerful. So, if done well, full looting will net the player more items and more items per minute, scale the enemies slower, and scale you much faster. Our massive item pool takes advantage of that sweet exponential scaling, but also just gives us way more chances to find those items we really need throughout a run in Eclipse, like movement, defense, and proper damage. This is how you reach consistency. So how do we play full looting effectively? Well, for starters, macro or build management is the soul of the experience. Utilizing scrappers, printers, cauldrons, and economy and item equipments like Recycler, Trophies Hunter Tricorn, and a credit card is the best way to control your builds and the things that you want. This means more items and more items that positively affect your build in a big way. The real benefit of full looting doesn't just come from more chances to roll good items, it really is usually carried along by all the junk items that you get that you can use for scrap. Scrap is king, and there's no excuse to leave a stage behind with an inventory full of items that don't help you when there was a scrapper. It might feel counterproductive to turn your items into actual junk that really don't increase your player power, but it's about the potential you gain from it. You only scrap things that aren't helping you now so that they can help you in the future. As you get more comfortable looting the stages, you'll find yourself backtracking less and less, saving more time, and getting items quicker overall. Because, to reiterate, time is a factor. In these runs you will fight more world spawn bosses and more big ticket enemies in the late game by design, but none of it really gets in the way, especially when that's prime time to scale up. It all boils down to how items interact and how you take advantage of that and push yourself past it. You'll have more speed, more defense, more single and area of effect damage, and all of that bundled together, the game just can't stop you. There's plenty to learn and practice, but I wish you well on your new path to consistency.
Grandpa's gonna sew the pants off for Santa. That's what Grandpa's gonna do.
We're gonna talk about scrappers now. I'm losing my goddamn mind. This video is so long. Okay, so scrappers and printers are king, but how do you know what to get rid of? Well, I'm going to give you some suggestions, but I need to emphasize that this is by no means a cheat sheet. Remember that everything is situational. Items like syringes and daggers are scrappable on loader, but not on commando, so keep that in mind. This is not a list of bad items, it's only to give you ideas. Items you can scrap in the majority of runs include bison steak, fireworks, medkit, monster tooth, PSG, bungus, roll of pennies, and war banner. Greens you can commonly scrap include bandolier, berserker pauldron, deathmark, harvester scythe, hunter's harpoon, infusion, leeching seed, lepton daisy, old war stealth kit, razor wire, squid polyp, and warhorn. Oof. Again, these items do have uses, and scrapping them isn't always a good idea, but getting rid of them will rarely ruin your build. White items you can scrap semi-consistently are backup mags, elixirs, soldier syringes, sticky bombs, tri-tip daggers, tougher times, and stun grenades. For greens, chrono baubles, old guillotines, predatory instincts, red whips, rose bucklers, shipping request forms, and wax quails. Again, these are a lot more situational. Scrapping these items can have major consequences if done at the wrong time. I'm not going to give an explanation for all of these items and every situation, but this is stuff you'll pick up on as you play the game more and encounter more situations. Try to experiment as much as possible. There's also items that you want during the main part of the game, but not necessarily during the Mithrix fight. Only scrap these items at the end of Stage 5. Topaz Brooch, Gasoline, Gore's Tome, Ignition Tank, Will-o'-the-Wisp, and Ukulele. This is also the point in the game where you can scrap red items. Scrapping reds before this usually isn't worth it because red printers can only spawn on Stage 5 and beyond, and even then, it's pretty rare. Many of the reds that are great during the mid-game aren't useful during the boss fight. Reds you can usually scrap on Stage 5 include Aegis, Alien Head, Raincoat, Bottled Chaos, Brain Stocks, Ceremonial Daggers, Frost Relic, Happiest Mask, Desk Plant, Nukahana, Rejuve Rack, Resonance Disc, Sentient Meat Hook, Soulbound Catalyst, Tesla Coil, and Wake of Vultures. The reasons you want to scrap before the boss fight is because there's an area on the moon where you can trade in your scrap for higher tier items. Many a run have been saved by this scrumptious soup, so don't overlook them. Make sure your white scrap is in groups of 3 and green scrap is in groups of 5 to reflect the cost of the soup. And try to make sure you're only getting rid of scrap. You don't want to gamble away your items if you can avoid it. When you're thinking thinking about trading 5 greens for 1 red, always assume it will take your best 5 items. That clover might look tempting, but if it takes all your ATGs, bands, and feathers, it's not worth it. Remember that Mithrix steals your items in Phase 4, so getting rid of items like Empathy Cores, Tesla, and Alien Head isn't a bad idea. But speaking of Mithrix, this is a fight you're going to have to become very comfortable with, as you need to beat him a total of 104 times to get gold. With everything, the secret here is practice, but there's some very important things to know about this fight. For instance, Mithrix is a huge threat when you're on the ground, but he has virtually no tools to deal with vertical mobility. And for this reason, Hopu Feathers and Head Stompers are the best items you can get for this fight. Like every enemy, you can learn his attack patterns and get consistent with dodging, but the easiest way to dodge 90% of his attacks is by getting in the air. If you don't have vertical mobility, another item that can be very helpful is Chrono Bobble. This item will slow him down significantly, and I would highly recommend having one for this fight, especially after Eclipse 4. His attack patterns do change slightly with Eclipse 7, he spams a lot more, but it's not too bad. That's kind of it for Phase 1, just run in a circle and stay in the air as much as possible. Phase 2 is pretty easy, but always target the wisps first. If you're not careful, they can eviscerate your health bar. Other than that, just play around the edge of the arena. You can get killed pretty easily if you stand in the center, so just rotate along the outside and use the pillars for cover. Phase 3 has a little bit more going on. It's similar to Phase 1, but he attacks faster and lunar monsters spawn. You can usually just ignore them. If you're super strong and can kill them easily, go for it, but they die at the end of this phase anyway, so it's not a huge deal. Do be careful with being in the air though, because if you're too high, lunar wisps will spawn, and you don't want that, so try to stay relatively low to the ground. Feather jumps are okay, it's just when you climb the ramp or get on top of pillars. Another difference with Phase 3 is Mithrix's pizza attack. He always does this after he jumps to the center, and you don't want to be airborne while he's doing this attack, because it can still hit you. Try to stay close to him when he does pizza. You want to be able to move out of it, and standing at the edge of the arena is a lot like rolling dice. To be honest, this attack will probably end a few of your runs, but just keep practicing and you'll get the hang of it before long. Phase 4 can be really frustrating if you don't know what you're doing, but it's actually pretty simple. First of all, you can skip this phase entirely by killing Mithrix while he's in the center of the arena with a Kaijaro band. This is because there are a few frames Mithrix is vulnerable between phases 3 and 4. If you damage him during that, it bugs out and he doesn't steal your items. But if you can't do this, just run around the arena in a circle, don't stand still or try to cheese him on the ramp. Just run around the arena and you'll dodge his shots, even shurikens. Now sometimes if you don't have enough speed, it can be a little bit wacky, and in these cases you're going to want to run Mithrix around a pillar and try to attack him when he turns the corner. That's basically the Mithrix fight in a nutshell. But what if I told you Mithrix wasn't the true final boss? Oh no, there's a boss much scarier, and it isn't Voidling. It's pillars. In Eclipse 1 through 7, charging pillars isn't a big deal, but the same cannot be said for Eclipse 8. Charging pillars without taking damage is incredibly difficult. There are these goddamn orbs on the moon that shit themselves for no reason, and it takes ages to get cleaned up. Wisps are another issue. They can follow you across the entire map and melt your health bar very, very fast. And perfected wisps are even worse. Respect these guys. Don't take risks when fighting them, play it safe. The best spot to fight them is on the dropship. You have a lot of cover there. This area also lets you fall back into the cave if you get overwhelmed. But that's why it's important to have pillar skips. Pillar skips are items or equipment that, like the name suggests, let you skip pillars. There are tons of different ways to skip pillars. I'll leave a link to a video covering most of them in the description, but the 3 most common ones are Eccentric Vase, Milky Chrysalis, and Volcanic Egg. Note, not every survivor needs a pillar skip. Half of them can just do it with their abilities. That about does it. One final tip for you. If you can find a group of friends to do the climb with, it'll make it a lot more enjoyable. If you play on PC, you can even do the climb in multiplayer now. Console folks, you'll get the DLC eventually, in theory, hopefully. I don't know. If you found this guide helpful at all, please consider leaving a like or a comment. As much as I hate asking, it really helps me out and also just lets me know you appreciated the video. I'm sure I've made a few mistakes in this video, so make sure to check the pinned comment for corrections. I apologize for the length of this one. Next video will be a little bit shorter. Before I go, I want to talk about some changes coming to the channel. First, there's a second channel now for stream highlights. I realized it didn't make sense to have them on this channel next to videos like this with high production value. So those videos are now over there and new ones will be coming out weekly. There's a join button now. This is basically a way you can show your support for these videos. Not required, but definitely appreciated. This is what I'm doing instead of Patreon. You also get access to emotes and I'll put your name at the end of my videos. I also want to give a big shout out to Race for being in this video. If you've made it this far, I imagine you're somewhat interested in Eclipse, which is Race's specialty. So go check out his channel. I've even edited a few of the videos over there, so go like those ones specifically and not any of the other ones. I don't know. I would recommend his macro itemization guide, where he expands on a lot of the concepts talked about in this video. This is the most time-consuming project I've ever put out, and I appreciate everyone who's made it this far. If you have any questions or are stuck anywhere, feel free to join my Discord, and I will try to help you. Well, I'll be damned, I'm late for my grandson's Fortnite tournament. Ta-ta for now.